Welcome to part 2 of the Biology 6 Digestive System lecture. At the very end of part 1, we finished discussing the GI tract organs. The GI tract organs are the digestive system organs that are parts of the gastrointestinal tract, and the major ones are the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. So now, at the beginning of this part 2 lecture, we are going to start discussing the accessory organs of the digestive system.
There are three other organs of the digestive system that are digestive system organs, but they're not part of the GI tract. And we call these the accessory organs of the digestive organ system. So digestive system organs that are not part of your GI tract are the accessory organs. So these accessory organs, like I said, they're not part of the GI tract, so they never touch the chyme. The chyme does not go through them. But that being said, they still help out the digestion of the chyme by secreting digestive juices into the GI tract. So all three of these accessory organs squirt their digestive juices into the GI tract. The three accessory organs are the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver, and I'll just quickly point them out here. The pancreas is a little hard to see, but if you look closely, it's kind of a yellowish organ, kind of tucked behind the stomach. Right there is the pancreas. The gallbladder is that greenish-looking organ right there, and the liver is sort of that brown-red organ right there. Okay, so yeah, all three of them secrete their digestive juices into the GI tract. And to be a little bit more specific, they squirt their digestive juices into the GI tract right there. So where I'm pointing, that's the duodenum of the small intestine. You know, that's the first curve of the small intestine is the duodenum. That's where all three accessory organs squirt their juices into. Now, it would be just wasteful of your body's resources if those accessory organs were just constantly churning out digestive juices, even when you didn't have any chyme in your system. You know, if you haven't eaten any food for a while, it would just be wasteful for those organs to be making their digestive juices. So the secretions, the digestive juice secretions of these accessory organs are controlled so that they're only made when you have chyme going through your GI tract. And so it's kind of interesting the way it works. Your GI tract organs have some sensory neurons in them. So your GI tract organs are able to detect when you've eaten a meal, you know, when there's chyme in there. And when those GI tract organs do detect that you have chyme in your system, then they use nervous system signals and hormone system signals to alert the accessory organs to start making their digestive juices. Okay, well, we will now go through these three accessory organs in a little bit more detail. The first one we'll talk about is the pancreas. And again, you can see it in this picture, the pancreas, kind of a yellowish-shaped organ right there, kind of tucked a little bit behind the stomach. And I think the next slide is a close-up of it. Here it is. In this slide, they made most of the stomach invisible. You can see the very end of the stomach there, but most of the stomach they made invisible. Yeah, and there's the pancreas right there. And, well, I guess they labeled it this first kind of C-shaped turn of the small intestine, that's the duodenum. Yeah, and so remember that it's in the duodenum that the chyme gets mixed with the secretions from the accessory organs. Well, let's see that happening. So imagine that there's some chyme in the stomach here. And so then this is the pyloric sphincter at the exit of the stomach. So after the chyme has been digested in the stomach for a while, the pyloric sphincter opens a little bit, and a squirt of chyme comes out of the stomach and passes into the duodenum of the small intestine like that. So there's the chyme there. Okay, yeah, so all three of these accessory organs start secreting their digestive juices to mix with the chyme. And so, yeah, let's focus in on the pancreas first. What sort of digestive juices does the pancreas make? Well, it makes several different digestive enzymes, a whole whole slew of different digestive enzymes. But the pancreas also makes a buffer in its digestive juices. And we talked about buffers earlier in the semester. Buffers are things that can neutralize acids. And here's why that's important. Remember that chyme we're seeing there just came out of the stomach. It was in the stomach just a moment before. And the stomach is an acidic organ. So that chyme became acidic when it was sitting inside the stomach. The acidic chyme that just arrived there in the duodenum could potentially burn the small intestine and damage those enzymes that are coming out of the pancreas. So to protect those enzymes and to protect the small intestine, the pancreas makes this buffer to neutralize the acids in the chyme. Okay, well, I didn't mention it here in the pancreas, but here in a few minutes, we're going to come back to the pancreas, and when I do come back to the pancreas, I'll mention something else about it. It secretes some hormones, including an important hormone called insulin. And so, like I said, we'll get to that in just a minute, but just make a mental note that the pancreas, in addition to secreting these digestive juices, also secretes some hormones, including insulin. Okay, but anyway, in this part, we're just focusing on its digestive juices, and that's these many different enzymes in the buffer. All right. So now let's move on to this next accessory organ, the gallbladder. So that's the one that they're showing in green there, right next to the liver. So a small accessory organ near the liver that stores bile and secretes bile into the GI tract. And there you see the gallbladder, and you see the bile being secreted out of it, and the bile goes down also into the duodenum to mix with the chyme. All right, so what is the bile? Well, I described it here as a detergent-like substance. So you think of maybe when you're doing the dishes after dinner, you usually have, what are some of those detergents that you use when you're doing the dishes in the sink? There's like Palmolive and Joy and Dawn, one of those liquidy detergents. That's the way to picture bile. It's a liquidy substance. And just like a detergent, it helps break up oils and grease. And I don't know what you necessarily eat for dinner, but oftentimes I'm frying something up. And so when I'm finished with my frying pan, it has some oil in it. And if I just use water in the sink with no detergent, that oil just sticks to the pan. The water can't carry it away. But if I add a few drops of detergent in there, then that breaks up the oil off the pan, and I am able to get the pan clean. And so that's what detergents do. They can break up oils and fats and get them to flow away in water. And so that's essentially what the bile is doing. Let me do a sketch here. So when you eat a meal, some of the nutrients in that meal are triglycerides. And we talked about triglycerides earlier in the semester. They are basically fats and oils. And just as an example of some fats and oils in the foods that we eat, as far as oils, I don't know, I tend to use a lot of olive oil or corn oil in my cooking. And fats like ice cream is a fatty food and bacon is a fatty food. And anyway, so fats and oils are made out of a type of molecule called a triglyceride. And triglyceride molecules are hydrophobic, meaning they do not mix well with water. But the problem is your chyme and your digestive juices are watery substances. And so the triglycerides that you eat don't spread out in the chyme because, like I say, they're hydrophobic, and the chyme and the digestive juices are hydrophilic. So the triglycerides tend to just form these tight little balls and not spread out in the chyme. And that makes them hard to digest. And there's actually a name for these little balls of triglycerides in your chyme. They're called fat globules. And like I said, because they stay together, because they stay in globules like that, it's hard for your digestive system to digest them properly. Well, that's where the bile comes in. The job of the bile is to break apart these fat globules into smaller bits that will spread out into the chyme. Here we go. Yeah, and when the fat globule is broken apart like this, then you can get good digestion of those triglyceride molecules. So like this is the equivalent of when you put a drop of palm olive or some other detergent on your greasy plate. It breaks apart the grease on the plate into little bits that go into the water in the sink. Okay, yeah, so that's what bile does, a detergent-like substance that helps digestion of fat by breaking down these large fat globules into smaller ones that spread out in the chyme and get digested more easily. Oh, just stretching, sorry. I saw somebody I remember I was attending a wedding, and it was that part where the person with the microphone says, yeah, does anybody in the audience want to say anything to the bride and groom? And this guy sitting next to me raised his hand, and they gave him the microphone. He made this really nice speech praising the bride and groom. And after the wedding, I said, Jason, that was a really great speech you gave. Did you prepare that? And he said, no, I was just stretching. And the guy handed me the microphone, so I just made it up on the spot. I was very impressed. It was a wonderful speech. Anyway, so bile is kind of a yellow-brown colored liquid. And that's one of the things that makes your feces the color that is. And so I'm saying that part of the feces color comes from the yellow-brown color of the bile, because the bile goes into your chyme, and then at least part of the chyme eventually becomes the feces. Here's something else that's kind of interesting about the bile and the gallbladder. So, like I said, the bile is a liquid substance. Think of it like palm olive or Joy or whatever those detergents are. But for some reason, sometimes it can crystallize into like little rocks of bile, and those are called gallstones. And gallstones can be painful. When you eat a meal, especially a fatty meal, the gallbladder contracts like a squeeze bulb to squirt bile into the GI tract. And so if a person has gallstones, when their gallbladder contracts, those gallstones scrape against this bile duct right here, and it's painful. And so if a person has those gallstones, the doctors can first try to break them into smaller bits, break the gallstones into smaller bits using ultrasound waves. But if that doesn't work, the doctors can just go in and cut out the person's gallbladder. And at first that seems a little crazy, like, man, they're just going to remove the whole organ. Yeah, with the gallbladder, you can live fine without your gallbladder. You don't digest fats quite as effectively, but you can certainly survive without your gallbladder. All right, so yeah, gallbladder stores up bile, and then when you eat a fatty meal, it squeezes like a squeeze bulb and squirts that bile into the duodenum to mix with the chyme, and it helps emulsify, helps break up the fat globules. All right, so let's do the liver now. So the liver is this larger organ sitting kind of on top of the gallbladder. And let me first go on a slight tangent. Every time I teach this Bio 11 class, I get enthusiastic about the liver because I've just decided it's one of the most amazing organs in the body because it does a whole bunch of different things. It's kind of the Swiss Army knife of the body. And let me just name a few that are unrelated to the digestive system. When we talked about the blood, I talked about some proteins called clotting factors in the blood that help your blood clot when you've cut yourself. Well, the liver makes most of those clotting factors. It's a clotting factor factory, so to speak. Another thing your liver does is it's your body's detoxification organ. Any potentially dangerous substances that get into your system like poisons that you might have accidentally swallowed, or alcohol or drugs. Your liver detoxifies those substances. Now, in today's lecture, we're focusing on the digestive system, and so the liver also has some jobs related to the digestive system. So let's talk about those. All right. So in terms of its role in the digestive organ system, the liver manufactures bile, and you might say, wait a minute, you told us the gallbladder does that. No, the gallbladder stores the bile, but the gallbladder does not manufacture the bile. The liver is the bile factory, not the gallbladder. And in fact, the gallbladder is really just sort of the liver's storage shed for bile. In other words, as the liver makes bile, the liver sends most of that bile down into the gallbladder for storage. Yeah, so think of the gallbladder just simply as the storage shed for the liver to store the bile. But that being said, the liver also sends some of the bile directly down into the duodenum. In other words, some of the liver's bile bypasses the gallbladder and just goes straight down into the duodenum to mix with the chyme there. So even if a person has their gallbladder removed because of gallstones, they still get some bile going into their GI tract, so they're still able to digest up fat globules in the chyme. As far as I know, the gallstones only occur in the gallbladder's bile duct. And why that would be, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, that's a good question. And I'm just going to take a guess. I'm not sure about this. But it might be that the bile ducts that come down out of the liver here, those just might be larger. And so maybe you just don't get gallstones that are scraping there if they do form. Yeah, excellent question. I never thought about that before. Okay. Hold off on this for a second, I'll come back to those in just a moment. So let's just talk about the three accessory organs again. So they are the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, and all of their secretions mix with the chyme here in the duodenum of the small intestine. Oop. Here we go, yeah. So there you see all three accessory organs, buffers and enzymes coming out of the pancreas, and bile coming down from the liver and the gallbladder, and all of those mix with the chyme here in the duodenum of the small intestine. Okay, now I noticed I accidentally skipped over a slide. Let me go back to something here. There. Here we go. So remember that this bile is kind of a yellowish brown color. If a person has a liver disease, sometimes the liver will get confused and stop sending the bile down into the GI tract. The liver will instead send that bile into the bloodstream. And so the person's blood starts getting these yellow-brown pigments from the bile. And as the blood circulates, it can deposit those bile pigments in the skin, and that's called jaundice. So if a person's skin starts getting a yellowy color, then you say that person has jaundice, and it's from the bile pigments that are building up in the person's skin, and it usually indicates a liver problem. It usually means that the liver is malfunctioning somehow. It can also be caused by a blocked bile duct that would also put bile pigments into the blood, but usually it's a liver problem. Okay, well, we're almost done with the liver, but I want to mention one more thing about it. So getting back to the GI tract organs, especially the major GI tract organs like the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine. So as those organs, those GI tract organs, are absorbing nutrients from the chyme, the nutrients go into blood vessels. There are blood vessels in the mucosa layer of the GI tract that receive those absorbed nutrients. Well, there's a special blood vessel that carries that nutrient-rich blood from the GI tract organs right to the liver, And we call that the hepatic portal vein. You can see it has some branches here in the stomach and in the small intestine and large intestine. So it's receiving nutrient-rich nutrients from those GI tract organs, and that nutrient-rich blood in the hepatic portal vein gets channeled directly to the liver. And so hopefully you find that kind of interesting. You might wonder, well, why is the liver the organ that first gets that nutrient-rich blood from the GI tract? And the answer is this, that one of the major nutrients in the foods that we eat are carbohydrates. Like we eat a fair amount of starch, which is a carbohydrate. And in the GI tract organs, the carbohydrates, like the starch, is digested down to its monomers, which are called glucose monosaccharides. And anyway, the liver's job is to store up glucose, to sort of be the glucose bank for the body. And so that's why you have a hepatic portal vein, so it can carry that nutrient-rich blood directly to the liver, so the liver can store up the glucose from your foods as a way of banking up the glucose for you. And we're going to come back to that in a few minutes and talk in more detail about exactly how the liver stores up the glucose for you. But anyway, right now I'm just mentioning that it's this hepatic portal vein that carries the nutrient-rich blood right to the liver. All right, well, are there any questions about the 3 accessory organs or any of the GI tract organs? Okay, well, we're sort of at a turning point now in this lecture about the digestive organ system. You hopefully now have a pretty good sense of the major organs of the digestive system and what their functions are. And so now we're going to change slightly what we're talking about and focus a little bit more on metabolism. So let me just introduce it this way, that there are thousands of different molecules in your body. And just to name a few, there are the 4 macromolecule types: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. But remember that each of those is actually a polymer. Each of those macromolecules is made out of joining some smaller molecules together called monomers. And so for proteins, their monomers are called amino acids. For carbohydrates, their monomers are called monosaccharides, with glucose being the most common monosaccharide. And for most lipids, glycerol and fatty acids are the monomers. And for nucleic acids, the monomers are called nucleotides. But there's a whole bunch of molecules other than the macromolecules and their monomers. There are different types of vitamins and just thousands of different molecules are in our body. And all of those molecules are constantly undergoing chemical reactions. A chemical reaction is where a molecule is changed in some way. And so, for example, there are chemical reactions in your body that can change carbohydrates into fats. And there are other chemical reactions in your body that can change fats into amino acids. And amino acids can be linked together to form proteins. That's a chemical reaction also. That's a change. And well, I could just go on. But anyway, there's thousands of different chemical reactions going on in your body all the time. And the name for all of those chemical reactions taking place in your body is called your metabolism. It just means that the sum total of all the chemical reactions in your body is your metabolism. Those metabolic reactions are all performed by enzymes. And we talked about enzymes earlier in the semester. And so let me just refresh you. Enzymes are proteins. I'll sketch it like this. Each enzyme is a protein, and enzymes perform chemical reactions for you. And again, a chemical reaction just means that a molecule is changed. And so let's say there's some molecule A, we'll just call it molecule A, that the body needs to change into a different molecule that we'll call molecule B. Well, there's going to be an enzyme for that. There'll be an enzyme that's able to take molecule A and do a chemical reaction on it and change it into this other molecule that we'll call molecule B, like that. Yeah, and so you have thousands of different enzymes because each enzyme type is performing one of these thousands of different chemical reactions that are part of your metabolism. Well, so here in this part of the lecture, we're going to focus on what we call the digestive enzymes. And so the digestive enzymes are the enzymes that are made by your digestive system organs. And the goal of your digestive enzymes is to break down macromolecules in the chyme into smaller molecules. And so imagine this is going to represent some digestive enzyme. Yeah, so digestive enzymes, their job is to take macromolecules in the chyme, like proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, for example. Yeah, so imagine this thing represents some macromolecule in the chyme, maybe a protein or carbohydrate or lipid or whatever. And so digestive enzymes, their job is to break that apart into eventually into its monomers. And why is it important to break them down into its monomers? Because remember that only monomers can be absorbed into your bloodstream through the wall of the GI tract. Macromolecules, any linked together monomers cannot be absorbed. They can't pass through the wall of your GI tract. Okay, I might have gotten a little ahead of myself. Oh, so this is just a diagram of some of the metabolic reactions that are going on inside your body. And obviously you don't have to memorize this, but just to give you an example, here's some molecule called L-xylulose. I think that's a carbohydrate. And this little arrow represents an enzyme that converts L-xylulose into L-xylulose, whatever molecule that is. And this arrow represents an enzyme that converts L-xylulose into L-xylulose 5-phosphate. And this arrow represents an enzyme that converts L-xylulose 5-phosphate into L-ribose 5-phosphate. And I have no idea what any of these molecules do, but the point is that you have thousands of different molecules in your body, and each one has an enzyme to perform chemical reactions on it. And we call all of those chemical reactions that go on inside the body your metabolism. So those are metabolic reactions, all the reactions of your metabolism. Okay, these digestive enzymes, again, are the enzymes that are made by your digestive system organs, and the digestive enzymes, their goals is to break down the macromolecules in the chyme into smaller molecules, eventually down into those monomers, so you can absorb them into your bloodstream. And I tried to capture that thought here. Only the monomers from the foods are allowed to pass into the bloodstream. The lining of the GI tract does not allow any intact macromolecules to pass through the wall and go into the bloodstream. Only the monomers. Now, in this diagram right here, this yellow part right here is supposed to be the lumen of your GI tract, the interior of your GI tract. And so, it's there inside the lumen of your GI tract that the digestive enzymes, which I'm showing as this green arrow, break apart the macromolecules in the chyme into their monomers. And as I've been saying, that's important because only the monomers are allowed to pass into the pass through the wall of the GI tract and go into your blood vessels. This is supposed to be a blood vessel here. All right, and so the way to picture these digestive enzymes, they're proteins that perform chemical reactions that break down molecules in the chyme into smaller molecules. All right, so what I want to do now is be a little bit more specific about these digestive enzymes breaking down the macromolecules in the chyme. And we'll talk about how the enzymes break down proteins eventually into their amino acids, and how these digestive enzymes break down polysaccharides eventually into their monosaccharides like glucose, and how these enzymes break down fats into eventually the monomers of fats, which are glycerol and fatty acids. All right, so let's begin with proteins. So this slide shows some protein-rich foods. Protein-rich foods include meats, dairy products, milk and cheese are pretty high in protein. Eggs, especially egg whites, are very high in protein. Nuts are high in protein. And beans are also very high in protein. Tofu, I think, comes from soybeans, so tofu is also high in protein. So if you eat any of these foods, you're getting a very protein-rich meal. And so your digestive enzymes have to break down those proteins into their amino acid monomers so they can be absorbed into your bloodstream. And so here's the cartoon of that. Here's a protein. And again, the yellow area here represents your GI tract, and this red area here represents a nearby blood vessel. Okay, so yeah, so the goal of these digestive enzymes is to break the protein apart down into its monomers, the amino acid. But here's the thing. Oftentimes, it's not possible for a single enzyme to break a macromolecule all the way down into its monomers. And so oftentimes, it's divided amongst two enzymes. Like one enzyme will first break down the large macromolecule, the polymer, into smaller polymers. And then there's a second enzyme, a different enzyme, whose job it is to break down the smaller polymers into their monomers. So they're sort of dividing up the task. One person breaks the initial macromolecule into smaller polymers, then another enzyme breaks those down into monomers. And that's what we'll see here for the proteins. There's an enzyme that comes in that just breaks it down into smaller chains of amino acids that we call peptides. The peptides are smaller polymers, shorter chains of amino acids. And then there's a different enzyme, different digestive enzyme that then comes along and breaks apart the peptides into their individual amino acids. And now that those are broken down to the monomer level, now those can be absorbed through the wall of the GI tract and go into your bloodstream, and then your bloodstream can use them, to build your own proteins out of. Good, yeah, so it's a two-step process. And here's pretty much the same concept, but for polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are in the carbohydrate family. So when we're talking about polysaccharides, we're talking about carbohydrates. The main polysaccharide carbohydrate that we get in our diets is called starch. And starch is a big polymer made up of a bunch of glucose monosaccharides all joined together. So when you eat, so what are some starchy foods? Well, anything from wheat, like bread and cereal and pasta, are starchy food. Anything from corn, which I guess is also some cereals, is also very starchy. Rice, potatoes are also very starchy foods. So if you eat any of these starchy foods, you're getting starch molecules. I call them polysaccharide here, but starch is the major polysaccharide. You're getting polysaccharides in your GI tract. And like I've been saying, those cannot pass through the wall of the GI tract, so you can't absorb those into your bloodstream. So there's an enzyme that breaks apart the polysaccharide first into smaller polymers of actually two glucoses. So yes or no, do you think those can pass into your bloodstream? No, they're not monomers yet, so they still can't pass through. So there's a second enzyme that comes along that now digests those disaccharides, which are the two glucoses linked together. It digests the disaccharides into the glucose monosaccharides, and now those glucose monosaccharides can be absorbed into your bloodstream. Yeah, so for polysaccharides like starch, goes polysaccharide, then digested into disaccharides, which are two glucoses linked together, and then the disaccharides finally get digested into monosaccharides like individual glucoses, and those go into the bloodstream. And lastly, let's talk about digestion of triglycerides. I said fat globules, but remember the fat globules are triglycerides made out of, so that they come from the fats and oils in your diet. Okay, so yeah, examples of fats and oils in your diet: cooking oils like corn oil or olive oil or safflower oil. Cheeses tend to have a lot of milk fat in them, so they are a fatty food. Butter is milk fat also, and lard. Like I don't know if you're eating steak or bacon, those white marbling parts of the meat are fat. They're lard. Okay, so when you eat these fatty foods, or I should say fat or oily foods which contain triglycerides, remember I was saying here, triglycerides are hydrophobic, so they don't spread out in the watery chyme. They stick together in these globules called fat globules. Oh, actually, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. So the individual triglyceride molecules look like this. Each triglyceride molecule, in other words, each fat or oil molecule, is made out of two types of monomers. One is called a glycerol monomer that you see here, and the other type is called a fatty acid molecule that they're showing in yellow here. So each triglyceride is made out of one glycerol plus 3 fatty acids. And if you need to review this, if you look at some of the lectures on the YouTube channel, there's one where we talk about lipids, and it's reviewed there. Anyway, so if you eat fats or oils, those are triglycerides. They look like that, triglycerides, and so they form these fat globules. Okay, so here's this yellow thing here represents a fat globule in the chyme, and the purpley things are each triglyceride molecules. And so remember that it's difficult, because all those triglycerides are sticking together in that fat globule. It's kind of difficult for your digestive system to digest them effectively. And so the fat globule has to be emulsified, which means broken apart, and that's where bile comes in. The gallbladder and the liver secrete bile into the GI tract, and the bile breaks up apart the fat globule, essentially separating out the individual triglyceride molecules, so they come apart from each other. They spread out from each other. All right, so yeah, we now have separated triglycerides, and now that the triglycerides are no longer together in the fat globule, now that the triglycerides have become spread apart from each other, now an enzyme can digest them into their monomers. And so there's an enzyme that will come along and break apart each individual triglyceride molecule into its monomers, the glycerols and the fatty acids. And then now that the triglyceride has been broken down into its monomers, those can be absorbed through the wall of the GI tract and go into your bloodstream the way they're supposed to. Okay, so just reviewing this, the digestive enzymes are what break apart the macromolecules in your chyme, eventually down into the monomers, but it's typically a two-step process where one enzyme first breaks it into smaller polymers, and then another enzyme breaks those smaller polymers down eventually into their monomers. Okay, so obviously these digestive enzymes are important to the proper digestion of your chyme. Which organs make them? I made a list right there. Let me see. I guess I don't have a cartoon of it here, but the pancreas and the small intestine are the major sources of digestive enzymes, pancreas and small intestine. The stomach and the salivary glands make a few digestive enzymes, but really most of them made by the pancreas and the small intestine. Okay, well, one of the things that I mentioned here is polysaccharides. And so just so you remember, polysaccharides are part of the carbohydrate family of molecules. And in our diets, starch is the major polysaccharide, and we some starchy foods, bread, pasta, rice, corn, potatoes, and cereals are very starchy foods. Well, we're going to now focus on carbohydrate metabolism. And what we mean by that is basically the chemical reactions that happen to the carbohydrates when you eat them. You know, sort of what sort of digestive enzymes work on carbohydrates, break down carbohydrates. And when the carbohydrates, like the starch, are broken down into their glucose monosaccharides, what happens to those glucose monosaccharides once they get absorbed into your bloodstream? So all of that, you know, the breaking down of the starch polysaccharides and into the glucose monomers, and what happens to those glucose monomers, that is what we mean by when we say carbohydrate metabolism. Okay, so here's a picture of some of those starchy foods like the breads and whatnot. So when you oh, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. So why am I choosing the carbohydrate metabolism? Why not I talk about protein metabolism or triglyceride metabolism? Well, carbohydrate metabolism is especially important because carbohydrates are the main fuel for your cells, so for your cells to make energy for themselves. If you remember earlier in the semester, we talked about a process called cellular aerobic respiration. And so this is a process that your cells do to generate energy for themselves. And here's a summary of it. To do cellular aerobic respiration, each cell takes in glucose from the bloodstream, and it also takes in oxygen from the bloodstream. And then the cell carries out a chemical reaction between the oxygen and the glucose. The oxygen breaks down the glucose into carbon dioxide gas and water, and that reaction of breaking down the glucose into carbon dioxide and water supplies energy for the cell in the form of ATP molecules. ATP molecules are high energy molecules that the cell wants because those ATP molecules power the proteins inside the cell. So anyway, that's why we're giving special attention to carbohydrate metabolism, because the carbohydrates get broken down into glucose, and the glucose is critically important as being the major fuel for your cells to make energy for themselves by cellular aerobic respiration. So yeah, the glucose from those carbohydrates is the major monosaccharide of the blood. The glucose is your blood sugar, and it's your blood sugar because it is the fuel for your cells to make energy by cellular aerobic respiration. Okay, so let's now look at the carbohydrate metabolism, and we'll use this gentleman here as our example of carbohydrate metabolism in action. And so he's going to eat that piece of bread, which contains lots of starch carbohydrate. Okay, so he eats the bread, and so in his GI tract, we're going to get some starch molecule. Here's the GI tract right here. Here's a nearby blood vessel. Here comes the starch from that bread he ate. The little blue circles again are glucose monosaccharides, because that's what starch is. It's a polymer of glucose. Okay, well, so there are digestive enzymes in his GI tract that eventually break down that starch into glucose monosaccharides. And I say eventually because remember, it's a two-step process. There's a first enzyme that first breaks it down into disaccharides, but those cannot be absorbed. And so there's a second enzyme that breaks down the disaccharides into glucose monosaccharides, which can be absorbed. So it's a two-step process, but eventually those digestive enzymes do break down the starch into glucose monosaccharides. Okay, and then because those are monosaccharides, they can be absorbed through the wall of the GI tract, so they go into the bloodstream like this. So let me make sure I'm not getting too far ahead. So carbohydrate polymers like starch are digested eventually down into glucose monomers in the GI tract in the alimentary canal. We'll skip this part for a second. We'll come back to that. And those glucoses become your blood sugar. They are your blood sugar, and cells use them as their major fuel. And so let me show you that. So here, there's a cell. That purple thing represents a cell in your body. And obviously you have more than one cell. You have trillions of cells, but we'll just use this to represent them. Yeah, so the cells take in the glucose from the blood and do cellular aerobic respiration from it. The glucose is broken down into carbon dioxide and water, but that process of the cellular aerobic respiration provides energy for each cell in the form of that ATP energy. Okay, now, so that's what most of the cells in your body do with the glucose, is break it down to make energy for themselves. But liver cells are special. Liver cells store the glucose. They don't break it down. And I guess that I mentioned that a few minutes ago, that's one of the jobs of your liver is to be the glucose bank for your body. And so that brownish looking thing there represents a liver cell. I know I made it look like the liver itself, but it's supposed to be a liver cell. And so yeah, the liver cells take the glucose out of your bloodstream and not to break it down, but to store it. And to be more specific, the liver cells store the glucose by linking it together into a polysaccharide called glycogen. So that glucose polymer you see inside the liver there is called glycogen. Oop, sorry, went a little ahead. There, that's glycogen. And so just as a reminder, glycogen is a lot like starch. Glycogen is a polymer of glucose, is just the way starch is. So you might wonder, well, what's the difference? The difference is who made them. If a plant links the glucoses together, we call the molecule a starch molecule. But if an animal, including ourselves, links the glucoses together, we call it glycogen, not starch. Anyway, so yeah, inside each liver cell, you'll find glycogen, which is just the liver cell's way of storing up the glucose for you. And the liver cells do that. The liver cells take glucose out of the bloodstream and store it as glycogen whenever your blood sugar is high, whenever you have lots of glucose in your blood. And that state is called hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia means you have higher than normal blood sugar concentration. Now, if your blood glucose starts to get low, then your liver cells will start breaking down the glycogen and secreting that glucose into your bloodstream. And so that condition of having low blood glucose is called hypoglycemia, which unfortunately sounds a lot like hyperglycemia, but hyper is high blood sugar and hypo is low blood sugar, hypoglycemia. So, focus there on the liver. That's why I said earlier the liver is like the bank for glucose. Just like your bank, if you have a lot of money, if you're wise, you put it into your bank account for storage. And then at some time later, if you start to run low on cash, you can go to your bank and get that money back out of it. And so, yeah, if your blood has lots of glucose, if you have hyperglycemia, then the liver cells bank it up, take it out of the blood and store it as glycogen. But if you start to get low on blood sugar, if you have hypoglycemia, then it goes in the opposite direction. The liver cells break down the glycogen into individual glucoses and put those back in your bloodstream to pump up your blood back up to the normal glucose levels. Does that sound all righty so far? Okay, now what I've just showed you here, this kind of summarizes some of the major points of carbohydrate metabolism. You eat the starch, and the starch gets broken down into the glucoses. That's part of your carbohydrate metabolism. Then those glucoses get absorbed into your bloodstream. That's also part of your carbohydrate metabolism. Then your cells use them, at least most of your cells use them for energy, with the cellular aerobic respiration. That's part of your carbohydrate metabolism. But also your liver cells taking the glucose out of the blood and storing it as glycogen, and then later on putting some of those glucoses back into your bloodstream. That's also part of your carbohydrate metabolism. So this slide summarizes a lot of the carbohydrate metabolism. Here's the thing. There's a few, it's even a little bit more complicated than what I'm showing here. There's a few details that I'm leaving out here. And so what I'm going to do is now go through this whole thing a second time, but add in a couple of details that I'm not showing in this picture. Okay, so here we go through it past number 2, but getting slightly more detailed about it. So we'll start off the same way. Here's this guy eating a carbohydrate-rich meal, like this big slice of bread. And so inside his GI tract, we get this starch molecule coming down. Okay, so remember there are enzymes in the GI tract that eventually break it down into its glucose monosaccharides, and then those get absorbed through the wall of the GI tract and go into the bloodstream. Okay, so this guy had this meal, especially a carbohydrate-rich meal, and so notice it results in a bunch of glucose going into his blood. And so after a carbohydrate-rich meal, what does he have? Hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia? Hyper, right, because that's elevated blood sugar. So he gets hyperglycemia. Okay, so, that's being out of homeostasis. There's a certain glucose concentration that the blood is supposed to have, and it's above that, right? It's hyperglycemia. So the body wants to get back into homeostasis. The body wants to lower the blood sugar levels back to their normal level. To lower the blood sugar levels, the cells have to take in glucose, right? Most of the cells in the body take in glucose to make energy for themselves, but the liver cells take in glucose to store. But the point is, to get back into normal blood sugar levels, all of those cells, the liver cells and the other cells, have to take in glucose. But here's the thing. The cells in your body don't know when your blood sugar is high. The cells of your body don't really have a way of sensing your blood sugar. So none of your cells in your body, not your liver cells or any other cells, know when it's time for them to take in glucose. So how do they find out? Well, that's where the pancreas comes in. This represents your pancreas. One of the jobs of the pancreas is to sense your blood sugar levels. Your pancreas is your body's blood sugar monitor, your body's blood sugar detector. When your pancreas sees that you have hyperglycemia, like after you eat a carbohydrate-rich meal, when your pancreas sees that you have hyperglycemia, your pancreas starts to release a hormone. And remember, hormones are signal molecules that travel in the blood. And so the hormone that gets released from your pancreas when you have hyperglycemia is called insulin. And sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Here we go. The insulin travels through the bloodstream and tells all the cells in your body to start taking in glucose. So in a nutshell, that means insulin lowers your blood sugar, right? Because the insulin will cause your cells to take in glucose from the bloodstream, and that will lower your blood sugar back to a normal level. So yeah, insulin lowers your blood sugar levels. And what are these cells, when the cells get the insulin signal, what do they do with that glucose? Well, we've talked about that. Most cells in your body, when they get insulin, take in glucose to make energy for themselves with this cellular aerobic respiration process. But the liver cells are different. When the liver cells get insulin, they take in the glucose and store it by linking it together to make glycogen. Okay, yeah, so notice a couple things. Notice that the liver cells are being the glucose bank by storing up the glucose. But notice the important role of the pancreas in this whole process. The pancreas is what detected that you had hyperglycemia, and the pancreas, in response, secreted out that insulin hormone to tell the liver cells and the other cells to take in the glucose. Let me go backwards for a second here. Go back. Yeah, so there's the hyperglycemia and pancreas. So let me just recap it. So when your blood sugar is high, like after a carbohydrate-rich meal, you have hyperglycemia, and the pancreas detects that, and in response, the pancreas secretes insulin. So I have that here. The pancreas secretes insulin when you have hyperglycemia, and the insulin lowers your blood sugar levels by making the cells take in glucose. Now, what I'm going to do in the next slide is zoom in on the tissues of the pancreas. So let's imagine we had a microscope, and we now zoom in. Notice that most of the pancreas's tissues is kind of this deep red, or maybe it's purplish colored tissues right here. But notice that also among the pancreas you have kind of a different looking tissue. It's kind of a lighter color here and here. Those lighter colored areas of the pancreas are called pancreatic islets, or sometimes they're called islets of Langerhans. Those are the parts of the pancreas that make the insulin hormone. The pancreatic islets, like here and here, are the endocrine glands in the pancreas that make the insulin hormone. What are these other tissues making? Well, remember the pancreas also makes digestive juices. It makes digestive enzymes and buffers. The darker colored red tissues of the pancreas make the digestive juices. The lighter colored areas make the hormones, like insulin. Okay, anyway, those pancreatic islets make insulin when you have hyperglycemia. The insulin is a signal molecule that tells all the cells to start taking in glucose. So in that way, the insulin lowers your blood sugar. Good, 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 good. Yeah. Well, high blood pressure is often caused by fats called plaques that build up in the blood vessels. And so it's not directly related to high blood sugar. Are you mixing up hyperglycemia and hypertension? Okay, yeah, I think you're mixing two concepts there. Okay, so when you have a carbohydrate-rich meal, you get hyperglycemia. The pancreas secretes insulin hormone, which lowers your blood sugar by telling all these cells to take in glucose. Now let's imagine that it's been a few hours after your last meal, and so your blood sugar starts to get low. Now, why is your blood sugar getting low? Well, your cells are still taking in glucose from the blood to use for energy, and so eventually your blood sugar levels start getting low. And remember, we call that hypoglycemia, where the blood sugar gets below the normal range. Well, that's also being out of homeostasis, and so your body doesn't want you to have low blood sugar either. And so there's a way your body raises your blood sugar when you have hypoglycemia to get it back into the normal range. And here's the way that works. So remember, your pancreas is your body's blood sugar monitor. So when the pancreas detects that you have hypoglycemia, the pancreas secretes a different hormone. It's different from insulin. This hormone's called glucagon. And the glucagon hormone is what signals the liver cells to break down their glycogen and secrete the glucoses back into the bloodstream to fix your hypoglycemia. And so remember, these pancreatic islets are the endocrine glands in the pancreas. So they are, in addition to making insulin hormone, they also make glucagon hormone. Okay, so there's the glucagon secreted by the pancreas when you have hypoglycemia. The target organ for glucagon hormone is the liver, and so the glucagon tells the liver cells to break down the glycogen into individual glucose monosaccharides. Those glucose monosaccharides then go into your bloodstream to boost your blood sugar levels, and so that takes you out of hypoglycemia. That puts you back into normal blood sugar levels. Awesome. So working together, the pancreas and the liver are able to keep you in blood sugar homeostasis to make sure you don't get hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia. I think the next slide, when I can find it, kind of summarizes the interplay between the pancreas and the liver and the blood sugar. Come on, come on, come on. 1 second. Here we go. So in your textbook, they show sort of a teeter-totter, a flat teeter-totter to represent when you're in homeostasis, when you have the right concentration of a certain molecule. And you don't have to memorize this, but for your blood glucose, they say about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood is the correct homeostatic set point. For my readings, I thought it was 100 milligrams per 100 milliliters, but like I said, you don't have to memorize it. So when they show the teeter-totter end going high like this, that represents when you have too much of the substance. So this represents hyperglycemia. All right, so when you have hyperglycemia, the pancreas detects that and secretes insulin hormone. The insulin hormone tells the cells to take in glucose from the bloodstream. Most cells take it in to burn it for energy, so to speak. The liver cells take it in to store as glycogen, but the point is the insulin lowers the blood sugar by making those cells take in glucose, and so that brings you back down into normal blood sugar levels. When your blood glucose gets low, which they're showing over here, the pancreas detects that, and then the pancreas secretes glucagon hormone, which tells your liver cells to break down the glycogen, and put glucoses back into the bloodstream. And so then, again, that brings you back into proper homeostasis. All right, and we're now going to look at carbohydrate metabolism a third time, but the twist on it this time is we're going to say if a person has a disease called diabetes. Diabetes, well, its full name is diabetes mellitus, but we can just call it diabetes in here. So diabetes is a disease, it's a disorder where the person's insulin system is not working. And so remember, insulin's job is to lower blood sugar. So if a person has diabetes, they're going to have high blood sugar because their insulin system is not working to lower their blood sugar. And so if I had to describe diabetes' main symptom in just one word, it would be hyperglycemia, especially after a meal because the insulin's not working. Okay, but let's go through it. So now this person here has diabetes and they're not taking any medicine for it. So we say they have uncontrolled diabetes. And so now they're going to eat this carbohydrate-rich meal. Here's their GI tract. Here comes the starch from that carbohydrate-rich meal. As usual, the digestive enzymes break down the starch into glucose monosaccharide, and as usual, the glucose monosaccharide gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and so the person gets hyperglycemia. So far, it's normal. But here's the thing, they get stuck in hyperglycemia because their insulin system isn't working. It can be that the pancreas, for example, is not able to secrete insulin, or in some cases it's the cells can't respond to the insulin, but in some way the insulin system is not working, so the person just gets stuck in hyperglycemia. And so that's the major symptom of uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, is just hyperglycemia, especially after a meal. There's a couple of other symptoms that relate to the urine, so let me talk about this. Oh, actually, before I talk about those, I should mention something else. So remember that one of the major functions, or the major function of blood sugar, of glucose, is to provide energy for your cells. Pardon me. Thank you. And so if the insulin system is not working, the cells can't get their insulin signal to take in the glucose and make energy for themselves. So at first you might think, well, if a person has diabetes, are the person's cells just going to starve to death from not being able to take in glucose? And the answer is no, because if cells are not able to take in glucose, the cells can start taking in other molecules from the blood, like fatty acids and amino acids, and get some energy out of those. But those are not the favorite fuel molecules from cells. Cells want glucose. And so when your cells are not able to take in glucose from the bloodstream, yeah, they can use other molecules for fuel, but they don't use those as effectively, And so the cells don't have as much energy as they would if they were getting glucose for their fuel. And since you are made out of your cells, you would feel tired and low energy if your cells are not able to get glucose out of your bloodstream. So the point I'm making here is, when a person has uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, their cells are not able to take in glucose. That's why the blood gets hyperglycemia. And so the cells don't starve, but the cells have lower energy from using alternative fuels. And so the person feels kind of tired all the time. That's also one of the symptoms of diabetes. I didn't list it here, but that's also one of the symptoms. But what I was going to talk about is there are also some symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes that relate to the urine. So let me talk about those. So here are the kidneys. You have a right kidney and a left kidney. Your kidneys make urine, but the kidneys make urine from substances in the blood. In other words, the water in the urine comes from water in the blood, and the salts in the urine come from salts in the blood. And so if there's anything in the blood that's way above its normal level, like extra glucose, if the person has uncontrolled diabetes, then that substance that is in a high amount in the blood ends up in the urine, because the kidneys make the urine from substances in the blood. So what I'm saying is, if a person has uncontrolled diabetes, those extra glucoses in the blood become glucoses in the urine. And so that's also one of the symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes. The urine starts getting sweet. Not that we taste our urine, but the urine starts getting glucoses in it from those glucoses in the bloodstream. So sugary urine, that's a symptom of uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. And not only does the person's urine get sugary, get glucose in it, they have large volumes of urine. So a typical person might urinate 1 or 2 liters of urine a day. A person who has uncontrolled diabetes mellitus might urinate 3 or 4 liters of urine every day. So why does the volume of urine increase if the person has glucose in the urine? And the answer comes down to this, that the high concentration of glucoses in the urine attracts water from other parts of the body into the urine. Now, who remembers the name for that? What do we call it where solute molecules attract water? Osmosis, thank you. And so this is just an osmosis effect. The urine gets extra solutes, extra dissolved molecules, which are these glucoses from the blood. And then anytime you have a high concentration of solutes, that attracts water by this principle of osmosis. And so extra water goes into the urine and in the kidneys, and then that extra water in the urine eventually goes down into the bladder, like you see there. And so, yeah, people with uncontrolled diabetes mellitus not only have hyperglycemia, but they also have glucose in the urine, and the glucose attracts water, so they have larger volumes of urine. Here's a kind of a poster I stole from a diabetes website. It lists some of the major symptoms of diabetes mellitus, and there's always tired. That's because the cells can't use glucose to make energy. Frequent urination. That's why I was saying that, because they have larger volumes of urine, they're going to the bathroom all the time. And likewise, the always thirsty is again because they're getting dehydrated because they're urinating so much extra volumes of water out of their body. All right, and because the person's blood is low on sugar, that sometimes can affect their brain function. The brain cells, the neurons in the brain, are especially dependent on glucose for energy, and so any sort of inability of the brain cells to get their proper glucose from the blood can make the person mentally confused and could perhaps even send them into a coma. Okay, well, I guess this slide summarizes some of the main aspects of carbohydrate metabolism. Any final questions on carbohydrate metabolism? Okay, well, there's one more topic here in this chapter on the digestive system. Oh, actually, there's one more thing I was going to mention quickly. So starch is this glucose polysaccharide that plants make. Plants also make another glucose polysaccharide that's different from starch. This other one is called cellulose, is its official name. Although unofficially it's sometimes called bran or fiber. The thing is, even though cellulose is also a glucose polysaccharide just like starch, we can't digest cellulose. So the cellulose in the foods that you eat, it never gets broken down and never gets absorbed. Our bodies just can't do that. And so at first you might say, well, it doesn't do us any good then, right? Because it just goes right through the GI tract without being absorbed. Well, it actually, the fiber in our foods is actually healthy for us. What they found is that even though we can't absorb this fiber, it somehow helps lower the cholesterol in our bodies. And that's generally a healthy thing, to lower your cholesterol. And they've also found that diets that are high in fiber, people who eat those high fiber diets have lower incidence of colon cancer. And so they're not exactly sure how that works, but it might be just as simple as the fiber sort of scraping out the insides of your large intestine as the fiber passes through. I know that sounds kind of gross or painful or something, but it's not. And they might think it just might scrape away some of the cancers that are forming inside the large intestine. But in any event, a diet that's high in fiber and cellulose is healthy for you. It gives you low cholesterol and lower chance of colon cancer. And if you look at a nutritional label here, if you go down to the carbohydrates part here, it tells you how many grams total carbohydrate is in the food you're eating. And then of those total carbohydrates, they tell you how many are fiber. So it looks like in this particular food, I think this is Quaker oats I was using. So per serving, 27 grams of total carbohydrates. Of those 27 grams, 4 of them are fiber. And of those 27 grams, 1 gram are sugars, which they mean like glucose. So the remainder is going to be starch. In other words, if you take the total carbohydrates, subtract out the fiber, and subtract out the sugars, which what would that be? 27 minus 4 and minus 1. Is that 22, I think? So it would be 22 grams of starch. That's how you can figure out the grams of starch in your food.
That brings us to the end of part 2 of the digestive system lecture. Now please start watching the third and final part of the digestive system lecture.